congratulations and what Greenly has in store for you in terms of updates and topics around it. So first we go into our agenda. We have some housekeeping items. Please utilize the chat as much as you'd like to ask questions throughout. After the panel discussion, we do have a Q&A session, but if you have questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat and we would be happy to answer them at any time. And then lastly, we will do a little thank you and wrap up. So these are just the overall agenda items for today's call. A little introduction about Greenly. For anybody that doesn't know who Greenly is, we're a climate tech company that offers a unique software which enables small to medium-sized businesses, but really all businesses of all sizes, to reduce and offset their carbon footprint. So we operate based on international standards such as SEC and EU regulations. Greenly is a technology automation that collects carbon analytics through integrations, and this is one of our most liked features since we integrate with over 100 software enterprises, including accounting and travel, to make carbon accounting accessible for everyone. Here are our amazing speakers of today. Brad, thank you so much for joining. If you would like to give a brief introduction, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. So Brad Molotsky from Duane Morris. Duane Morris is an international law firm. I focus my practice on transactional real estate. So I help clients buy, build, operate, finance real estate throughout the US. We have folks that do that abroad. I don't do that overseas. I helped my former company, which is a publicly traded REIT on the New York Stock Exchange, create their sustainability program back in about 2010, when many of, I suspect, the audience members were in grade school, and continue to focus attention, time, energy on various and sundry ESG and sustainability platforms, and try to bring that to my clients relative to their building and their operations. A lot of that of current focus has been around what's going on with the SEC. So, you know, our conversation here is timely. And folks continue, at least worldwide, to be interested, focused on doing things in the space being defined as ESG or sustainability. But in the United States, it's still a little bit challenged. So thanks for having me and look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. And then secondly, we have our CEO and co-founder, Alexis, on a call. Alexis, if you would like to do a brief introduction, that would be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks again, Brad. Looking forward to learning from your legal expertise on this. What I can say is, you know, a little bit about Greenly. And so it's a company we co-founded about 4 years ago with the premise that everyone, literally everyone, every company was going to start tracking its emissions and set a path towards net zero. And of course, you know, along the way, the regulations are a big tailwind here. But what we've learned, you know, we're already 170 people at Greenly. We have about 1,500 customers now, and the reason we've been, in a sense, have grown so fast is that we decided to target two kind of players, mid-market companies that have a specific reporting need of their emissions, usually because they, of course, it's the right thing to do, but it's also something that's good for their business, right? It's something that they are asked to do for compliance reasons. We'll talk about that, but very often because they're they are suppliers to a larger company, and we help solve that problem. And the second type of customers that we work with are actually the procurement departments, the purchasing people that do put that pressure on those suppliers to track their carbon, because you're this big company and you've set an objective maybe for 2030 to be net zero or something like that. and of course you can't do it alone, because a large part of your indirect emissions are those of your suppliers. And so we help do that. And we work with suppliers, supply chains, basically. We work with procurement departments to reach out to all those suppliers. And I think that kind of explains the pace of our growth. So happy to talk more on that, maybe, but through the angle that we chose to discuss today with Brad.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so I would say let's dive in and talk about SEC upcoming regulations, what that could potentially look like. And one of the pressing questions we have researched is what is going to happen with Scope 3. Is there any insight that you can provide in terms of how could companies prepare, and also the importance of Scope 3? Anything you could potentially share with the audience would be great.
I can definitely potentially share. I can actually share as well. But the real question, or I guess the real answer, is it's a bit of a crapshoot at the moment. The SEC had announced that they were definitely going to finalize their rulemaking in April. Well, we're now in, what are we in? June. They haven't finalized the rulemaking. There was a pronouncement a couple weeks ago that they were likely to do it in the fall. The fall being whatever, September, October, November. So what are we talking about? The big kind of issue I think that they're grappling with, but they're not consulting with me, obviously, is Scope 3 and whether and how to include that in the disclosure rules. And so part of that issue, even, there were in the United States, unlike, in Europe and afar in Australia, there's, some consternation relative to there's a variety of states that are not overly interested in ESG or being regulated. There are a bunch of states that believe that it's the right thing to do, as was said before by Alexis. And so, part of that struggle has to do with even those that are in favor of, we're very concerned about the ambit of the rule making and the requirement to report on Scope 3. A bunch of friends who are sustainably focused and doing really good things, their concern was that once they had to report Scope 3, they still had stuff to do on Scope 1 and 2. So what they were doing, what their utilities were doing, that was a lift, and to get there was important. Scope 3, as the audience likely knows, is your supply chain and your employee travel. And so, to your question, Sarah, I think that what the original rule had in it that got 10,750 comments, which is like the most comments ever received by the SEC on anything. The most comments were focused around Scope 3. What are we talking about? What standard are we going to use? If we are aspirational as opposed to specific, how does that work? And, how are we supposed to measure this? What standard are we going to use? Are we going to use science-based targets? Are we going to use TCFD? Where are we going and what are we going to use? And so, again, there's not been a lot of discussion as to kind of what the delay is. Politically speaking, clearly the Biden administration is very interested in getting these rules promulgated, passed, and effective before the election. And so I think you're going to see some movement for sure this fall so that that's done, so that they can claim a win on this front, at least to their environmental base. It's highly likely that the Republicans will challenge it no matter what's in there. And so there will be some level of, an appeal and or lawsuit claiming that the SEC doesn't have jurisdiction to regulate this. So that's expected. But if I had to prognosticate, which is where you started, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride here, my sense is that they will probably maybe dial back the timing. So the timing relative to disclosure on Scope 3, instead of kind of an on-ramp of 24, 25, will get pushed out to maybe 25, 26, 26, 27, to give people more time to digest what we're talking about and how to measure it, to find the right set of software that they can implement, and to utilize that in connecting systems. So again, the stuff that Greenly does every day, many companies in the United States aren't aware of that and or what scope 3 is and how it's going to affect them. So if we say, hey, the rules get passed and the SEC, it's not that many people that are affected, the reality is that there's a bunch of public companies, but it's everyone in their supply chain that will be affected by this, because those public companies will then start to ask their supply chain, hey, we needed this information, give it to us. If you can't give it to us, we're not going to use you, which is why systems like Greeley are going to be so important on a go forward. So let me pause there. I know Alexis has some thoughts, I'm sure.
Yeah, so really two things. One is, I think, why is the calendar being disrupted? And I think I have a different opinion than you on that. It's not necessarily because scope 3 is hard, and 2 is scope 3 that hard? So I've been speaking, to a lot of companies on both sides of the Atlantic, and what we realize is that the SEC regulations, in fact, have a kind of combo effect with the European regulations. So obviously this webinar is about the SEC, but the thing is, Europe has already disclosed the CSRD regulations, corporate sustainability regulations, reporting directives is what it stands for. And it basically means that any company above 500 employees now, above 250 employees tomorrow, will have to report their emissions, right? But the thing is about this, and that starts early 2024. And the thing is, the US is the one country with the highest number of international companies in the world. So it's estimated that about 10,000 US companies are going to be impacted by CSRD. And so what the SEC wants to do is it doesn't want to get the US corporations reporting on one standards for the SEC and another standard for the CSRD. So you have two regulations that CSRD is a pretty vast thing. So it has, climate stuff, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. It has extras, and that's, I guess, the part that requires the most work. And it has other things about governance and HR and so on. But the thing is, if the SEC publishes a rule that asks for certain stuff in a certain format, and companies also have to report this stuff to Europe under another format, it's 2 times the work. I mean, of course, guys like us can, slice and dice the data in different formats to make the work easy, but still, not everybody's working with Greenly yet. So it's perceived to, so I think the SEC wants to minimize the reporting workload. And so they're basically, I've been told by basically ESG leaders from corporate America that this was one of the reasons the regulation was being delayed. So that's number one. And number two, as you said, I think what you said is true, right? There is this debate around scope 3 and this being perceived as something complex. And this is where I would argue that it's perceived to be complex, and it can be complex, but there is a multi-tier approach to how detailed, how granular you are about scope 3. And so with the right kind of tech, you can actually start reporting your scope 3 relatively easily, and then it's a lot of work to do it in a very, very granular way. Let me explain. I don't know if everybody on the attending knows exactly what scope 3 is. Maybe I should have started with this, and apologies for that. But so when a company reports its emissions, right, it reports its direct emissions, what's coming out of your factory, your operations, your company-owned cars, so the fuel that you burn, basically. That's scope 1. Scope 2 is the emissions linked to your energy consumption. So you're consuming a lot of electricity. The emissions come out of the factory from, Excel or a Southern company or whatever. And so that's your scope 2. Scope 3 is everything else. So when you buy a computer, when you buy goods and then resell them, when you take an airplane. So all these emissions are linked to other companies, but because you have this business activity, so if you're Walmart, basically, for instance, you buy and sell millions of goods. Your scope 3 is all the stuff that's in the Walmart. And so figuring out what the emissions of all your suppliers are, that's scope 3, computing scope 3. And to that point, so there's pushback basically from companies who don't want to incur that additional workload. And the argument that they make, and which forces a lot of debates to happen, I think, with the regulator, is to say it's very hard to have a good sense of what the emissions of my supply chains are. But in fact, you can always have, let's just be very practical. The way we do it is we look at all your spend, we automate it, we put it into a software, and we categorize every single expense, and we convert spend against weighted carbon. So you're spending $1 million on buying steel. We know on average that $1 of steel is X amount of CO2. So it's a spend-based approach. It's not very accurate when you do only that, but it gets you 95% of the way on scope 3. And that's actually very easy to do. But now, of course, if you're Walmart or if you're General Motors, that's not enough. So then you have to pick the single biggest categories and get one level deeper. It's not how much I spent on buying steel. It's how many tons of steel I bought and what's the emission of each ton of steel. And so that's the harder work, right? And that's where you need also software, as a matter of fact, to get down to it. So I think that's why there's so many discussions, is how detailed do you want to be on this? Because the more detailed you are, unfortunately, the more work there is, basically.
Yeah. Okay, that was very helpful. And Brad, thank you so much for putting the comments to basically explaining the acronyms and also scope 1, 2, and 3. That's very helpful for our audience. Alexis, around that topic, or for both of you really, there is a big conversation around greenwashing and scope 3, and especially the supply chain. What kind of comments, suggestions, inside scoop do you have for us around that topic? Loaded question.
There are lots of ways that you can do greenwashing. I think this calls for a definition. In my sense, greenwashing is when you claim to be a model, in terms of an example to follow in terms of, best in class for environmental stuff, when you're not actually doing that much of an effort, right? You're not. The energy transition is hard, right? It's about reducing your emissions. It's very often about changing your business. And I think to be super clear, when a company says it's carbon neutral, it runs a very high risk of doing greenwashing, because it's essentially saying, look, I tracked my emissions. To which extent have I tracked my emissions? Maybe I only tracked my direct emissions. Maybe I forgot 90% of my emissions, which are scope 3. So I tracked it, and then I offset it. So I funded a number of projects. And these projects, are capturing or avoiding as many emissions as I'm doing. So if you're saying you're carbon neutral, having tracked only your scope 1 and 2, so your direct emissions and your indirect emissions linked to energy consumption, then you're probably greenwashing. But even if you say I'm carbon neutral, having accounted for your scope 3, so it's much more expensive because you have to buy, you're probably greenwashing too, because you're not really doing anything to reduce your own emissions. And we know that there aren't enough offset projects available to offset all the emissions of the world. So you're grabbing your fair share of offset, and it's interesting to finance offsets, don't get me wrong, but you're not really off the hook if you don't actually have a reduction strategy, to put it simply. And I think, and I'll finish on that on that topic with this, is there's actually now a relatively important risk of liability to claim that you are carbon neutral. So you may have seen there are a couple of airline companies, Delta is one, KLM is another, that are, there are class actions against them, saying you've been telling us for years that this flight was carbon neutral, when really perhaps it wasn't. I mean, and so I wouldn't have taken this flight had I known that you are only buying certain projects that may or may not have really offset my emissions. So I'll let Brad, who's a real lawyer, talk to the chances of those class actions, leading to something. But that's in the US. In Europe, there's actually laws against misleading advertisements, so you can get fined for claiming to be carbon neutral. So I think the culture here is shifting. You're hearing businesses all day long telling you that they're carbon neutral, and I think these people will soon realize you need to talk about going towards net zero, which is a little different.
Yeah, look, I'd echo your comments. I agree. I think that the SEC, not only, irrespective of what I think, the SEC has clearly dialed up their rhetoric and focus on enforcement. That started in 2021 into 2022, and they haven't stopped in 2023. I kind of put in the chat a couple of companies that they focus on. The areas of focus include the beginning of what the rules will get to, which is, what are you disclosing? What do you have to disclose? And then when you disclose, making sure that there's verifiable information relative to the disclosure. So you can't just say something, you've got to have it backed up by way of facts, numbers, and that will require, under the proposed rules, if they're final, an audit. So a third party, not just yourself saying it, but a third party needs to verify that. Typically, it'll be an accounting firm or a cottage industry. There's somebody verifying that has the chops to do that. So you've got kind of a disclosure requirement with a verification requirement. That's on the SEC side. You've got the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, for the first time in 10 years, updating their, what they call their green guides. And that has to do with advertising. So when we're advertising products, when companies are advertising products, what can they say without running afoul of disclosure rules? So there's one thing to be aspirational, we attempt to, we endeavor to, we want to, versus we have. And in products, when they say eco-friendly or organic or green, what does that mean? And when it says all natural, there have been a variety of claims made from not only governmental organizations, but NGOs, non-governmental organizations, suing on behalf of individuals, and individuals suing companies for false labeling. And so we've got kind of a regulatory regime from the SEC and the FTC. The SEC will bring enforcement actions where they see actions, words that don't match actions. We've got the FTC that provides these green guides that allow for private individuals and or entities to sue companies in the United States relative to their disclosure. And that has increased markedly over the last 2-3 years. So my firm and others track class action lawsuits, and the ramp up of class action lawsuits in the ESG sustainability space is kind of, the trajectory is left side of the page, up to the right side of the page, growing daily almost, not to be dramatic, but there's a massive amount of this type of litigation. Companies that of being sued, so for instance, just to pick one, not to pick on, but to pick one. So Sunkist orange juice, which I believe is owned by Pepsi, it claims it's all natural. Somebody tested the orange juice, and in the orange juice is a forever chemical, PFAS. And so whether that came from the plastic that the orange juice is in, or the labeling, or the lid, or the original when they were doing the orange juice. Who knows? But there's a lawsuit relative to the claim that it's all natural when in fact it has these chemicals in it. And so that's just tip of the iceberg. Those are the types of claims that are coming, I'd say, fast and furious as individuals and NGOs realize that this is a way to call out, as Alexis was saying, companies that are making claims that they can't back up. And so we've got investors suing companies. They own, stock in the company and they don't like what they're seeing. We've got individuals that are claiming damage suing. We've got NGOs claiming false advertising. And then we have the federal government, through the SEC, making claims. A bunch of this, to Alexis's point, revolves around, what are you saying and can you back it up? And so that's the big premise. And if you can't, then you're whitewashing, and in this space, greenwashing. You're making false statements that you can't substantiate. Okay. Add to that, under the SEC's proposed rules, there's a concept of if the impact of your emissions is material, quote unquote, that's kind of a legally charged principle. So if it's material to the company, then you're required to disclose scope 3. Okay, so the original thinking was, well, a bunch of companies are going to say it's not material to the company and therefore I do not need to disclose. Now, materiality is kind of like the United States, there's an old case that says the definition of pornography is, when you see it. So materiality is different for each company. The bigger you are, the bigger something needs to be in order for it to be material. And materiality ties into, does it have an impact on your financial statements, or whether an ordinary, reasonable, prudent investor would want to know about it. So again, there's some, subjectivity to that. Well, what the SEC said was, okay, we hear you relative to if it's material or not, that triggers scope 3. But if you have disclosed a net zero target, you are automatically deemed to have tripped into materiality and are required to report on your scope 3. Now, there's a bunch of companies that aspirationally, or they thought they could do it, or they wanted to be supportive, which is all good, of net zero. And so there are a lot of public companies that have announced net zero goals. When they have done that publicly, it's hard to walk that back. It's hard to say, well, I don't think we can comply, so we're not going to have a goal anymore. The fact that they have announced a goal, if they don't kind of walk it back, they're then, in the proposed rules, required to report on scope 3. So there's a nexus, a connection between net zero targets being announced and scope 3 emissions requirements. So again, you'll see some of that, and it will, in an odd way, depending on where the rule ends up, it'll make some companies reticent, I think, to suggest aloud what their net zero targets are. To Alexis' point, without having specific ways to get there, you're going to see much less by way of aspiration, which I think is not so good. But the reason for that is people do not want to fall into this quagmire of, do I have to report on scope 3, even though we would all agree that it's not that big a deal, although it's, the bigger your portfolio, the more tricky that gets.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you give us a lot of tangible information here. And just like listening to what you both have to say, I feel like our customers or clients can feel easily overwhelmed. So with the SEC regulations being pending, what would be some practical recommendations that we can give our clients that they could do now?
So I think there's a bunch of things you could be doing now. One, if you're a U.S. company and you're doing business abroad, as Alexis said, you have to be paying attention already. So if you're selling into the EU, you better be on top of this, or you're going to run afoul of what we were talking about before under the EU's rules relative to what they require to be disclosed. So the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, is the underlying standard for Corporate Social Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And so you better be aware of that. Okay, let's assume that not everybody's selling into the EU and they're not always enlightened. Well, if you're a public company, you can either hope's not a good strategy, but you can hope that these rules don't get passed, or if they get passed, that there's a lawsuit right away. Not a good approach. So one, somebody at the company should be reviewing the rules. And I suspect somebody is, whether it's they have a chief sustainability officer, or it's the head of legal, or it's your CFO, your chief financial officer. Somebody at these public companies is likely reviewing the rules, hopefully. Why? Well, because the rules set forth kind of a, not lockstep, but an approach relative to the company. What do I mean? The rules, when adopted, have a requirement around the board. So you have to disclose who on the board has expertise. If you don't have expertise, you got to disclose that, which would embarrass most companies. So they should be thinking about who on their board has the expertise, or who can acquire it, or adding a board member that has the expertise. Separately, but related, same thing on senior management. Who in senior management at the company has the responsibility for kind of sustainability, and who's got expertise in it, and what internally are you doing to create connectivity across company lines? So if you got different regions, different product types, who's responsible and how's that happening? So again, I would be reviewing your board expertise. I'd be reviewing your senior management expertise. If you don't have those skill sets, acquire it, or be prepared to disclose that you don't have that. So what we just talked about a minute ago, I would start to look at what pledges you've made publicly. So if you've pledged net zero, you better understand what that means. If you've voluntarily decided to participate in a variety of different things, make sure that that doesn't trip you into materiality. I would be taking the time now, while this is up in the air, to review everything that's in writing. So again, a lot of companies, more every year, more every quarter, are publishing ESG reports or sustainability reports, which is great. Tells what's going on at the company, what their goals are. Okay, it is great, period, full stop. Well, everything in those reports is now going to need to be harmonized with the other financial statements that they've made, and a determination on materiality is going to need to be made. So you're going to get, I suspect, a lot of CFOs and general counsels of public companies saying, I don't want this disclosure happening because now then we have to verify it. So that's a negative possibility, but I would be reviewing all of that disclosure to make sure that under the taxonomy, what we say can be verified, and where, so you have line by line, where's this number coming from? Where's this statement coming from? How are we vetting it? Are we using Greenly as our source material? Are they the ones giving us that? Where's that coming from? And then I would start to find companies, so you've got kind of, here's my disclosure, understand it. But I would then be at the same time finding a company like Greenly that is going to be able to take all this data from all my properties and put it into a place and show me what the impact is. Because the companies are not really equipped to do that internally. They don't have the software. They don't really understand what scope 1, 2, 3 is, or if they do, they don't have somebody that's really on point. If they have somebody on point, they don't have the wherewithal to take 1,000 product lines, drop it into a place, and show what the emissions are. So again, having a consultant that understands this, that can marry that to the EU standard, like you guys, is relevant, important. So be interviewing people now so that you've made a decision on who you're going to use, and then have them show you what software there is. What are they using? Are they using their own product, or are they using something that, sort of talks across these various systems, which is a little bit tough at the moment because we don't know what the system is. We know what the EU is. We don't know where the US is going. So reviewing who your consultant is, interview those people, reviewing what software they use or what can I buy that will help me to start to create connectivity internally across company lines, across regions, across time zones. So again, it's a lot. And there are various companies that have been paying attention to this for a while and have been doing this, to the point raised earlier by Alexis. There's a bunch of companies that this will be a total surprise to, that, oh my God, how did this happen? And it will be a thing, a big thing, because it's very hard to play catch up here. A lot of this conversation is iterative. You need to understand what we're talking about first, before you can attack it, rather than just jumping into the deep end and saying, well, how do I do this? And you end up wasting time on trying to get the data that's relevant. In the United States, it's very difficult in some geographies to get utility data. Okay, so it sounds kind of silly, but how much I'm consuming at my own space and what am I doing on water, waste, energy, recycling? That should be like kind of C-spot run, easy to figure out. It's not, because many utilities share, but many others do not. They will not allow you to get real-time data. The data you're getting is like 30 days stale, and it doesn't really relate to your space. It's like 1 meter for an entire building kind of thing. So there's a lot that needs to be done kind of from a software measuring, monitoring, infrastructure perspective in order to get to the right data, which is, again, goes back to why companies are going to need companies like you guys, Greeley and others, to help them create the data sourcing and to verify that so that it's not all internal. Even though the internal people are going to need to certify that they've looked at and they agree, they're going to need a source, and the source is likely going to be you guys, somebody like you guys.
So if I can interject, so with your and of course this makes sense. You're looking at it from a compliance perspective, and for sure, if you're a legal officer or a person in charge of risks in a particular company, this is something you need to think of. And if I get you correctly, you could say pretty much anything you wanted before, and nobody was auditing it, or it couldn't be like absolutely false, but since there was no standard, it wasn't really clear what a misleading statement was. And now it's basically over because there are regulations coming and they've already been announced and we're discussing the commas and so on, but it's happening. So we already know what is misleading and what is not. There's a kind of and so it can go through the courts before it goes into law or anything like that. This makes sense, but and that's fine. But what I would like to emphasize as well is, most of the business that we do, if there's one thing we learned working with all these companies, is for sure the regulations are there in the background. But if you're looking at this strictly from a compliance perspective, you're missing part of the point, in the sense that, you have to imagine that, this path towards net zero is not going to go away. Most governments are betting on it. It might not happen as fast as some of us would like, but it's happening nonetheless, right? And so it is also a business opportunity. So yes, you have to prepare now, because big organizations, will take time to get it exactly right when it's really compulsory. You're perfectly correct on that. But there's an even stronger reason to start now, is that companies that are strategically positioning themselves as at the forefront of this are already gaining market share, basically. Because what's happening is you've got a couple leading companies, just take the US, you've got people like Microsoft, who are making these huge pledges, Walmart, et cetera, et cetera. So these guys, they're already pressuring their supply chain. So they're already telling a lot of listed companies that they're only going to keep doing business with them if they are themselves aligned with their own net zero pathways, right? Which means that this is not strictly a topic for your company's legal officers. It's actually a topic for your chief revenue officer. That he's gonna have a business problem, and I think it's what's interesting about this rule is it's already having business effects, and it's actually the business incentives that are nudging people into moving fast, right? But once they do, of course, start to track their emissions, start to showcase this in front of their customers, show them that they are doing things, not just reporting, by the way, but actually reducing their emissions. Well, they also want to do it along the legal standards, yes? So compulsory or not.
No, look, I totally agree with that. I think that you've got, put aside Europe for a second. In the US, you got companies all along the continuum. So some are, not even crawling, some are crawling, some are walking, some are jogging, and some are running. Meaning they've been in this space, they are leaders of it, and they are all about it. And it depends on kind of who you are and where you're coming from and what you do as to where you're there and what the senior management and board's values are. So again, not everybody is kind of where the four of us and people on the call are at. And so, it doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just kind of, well, it makes it wrong, but that's the whole other thing. It doesn't make it right or wrong in the sense that, we need to recognize where we're at, and this, sort of where we started. The SEC's rules will compel, not volitional, so not voluntary. It will mandate movement and disclosure. And if you don't do it, you're going to be, kind of in trouble, fined and or called out. And so that's what some are rebelling against. They don't like government telling them what to do. They don't want to be fined, blah, blah. So this rule will move the marketplace. Whether people are paying attention or not, in my view, it's going to have a significant effect on those that are paying attention already and on those that are not paying attention in particular. And all the people that are like, well, I'm not a public company, what do I care? You're going to care, because if you're supplying any of these companies, you're going to very quickly start to get bombarded with surveys and questionnaires and what are you doing and how are you doing it and what's your emissions. And if you can't answer that, these companies are going to look at that and say, okay, I don't have time to figure this person out. I'm moving on. I'm going to find somebody else. And so that's what's going to happen, I think, relatively quickly, 2 years out, 1 year out. And these companies are going to make decisions relatively quickly because they're going to need to make those disclosures, and they're not going to be able to afford to wait anymore once this becomes effective, in my view.
Yeah.
And just before Q&A, if I can add one point on this, carbon disclosure regulations that are coming. I know that in the US specifically, there are lots of debate on ESG, and there are anti and pro ESGs, etc. To me, the climate disclosure should, and I don't know if it will, maybe Brad, you have a more informed opinion than me on this, but it should depoliticize the debate. There's no, in my view at least, tracking carbon, reducing emissions. These are things that are inspired by science. Now, some people politicize science for sure, but still, there's this IPCC report, and we want to decarbonize, and we're strictly focused on climate. And it seems to me that that's what we need to focus on. And in the whole ESG debate, where I would be in favor of kind of singling out the E, that is the environment, and focusing it on emissions, that is, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, what we've been talking about. And I think not talk too much about the S&G, which kind of seems to be polluting the debate. Now, I'm polluting the debate myself now, perhaps because I'm talking about this, but I did want to have your opinion on that.
Yeah, so look, that's an interesting, there's a lot there. So, do we separate the E from the S and the G? Some people have been there for a long time. That they talk about sustainability, and sustainability is kind of the E part. The S and the G are social and governance. How are we doing things, and what are we doing on the social landscape, relative to child labor, relative to gender, relative to LGBTQ, how are we dealing with like cyber and board governance? That's different than how are we dealing with the, climate and climate change, and what are we doing on water, waste, energy? So there's a bunch of folks that are, there. To your point, some, we don't want to say which party, but some, the Republicans, are, in the United States, there's, this in a variety of places, 17 states, have proposed or passed anti-ESG type legislation. So we've got 17 states out of 50 that have passed or are working on passing what they're calling anti-woke. Now, is that focused on the S and the G? Yeah, but, a lot of it is. But other pieces of it are focused on, hey, we as a state, we have employees, teachers, firefighters, civil servants, police. We are saying we will not allow you to use ESG as a lens if you are going to manage the money for those civil employees. So not that you have to invest in all renewable companies, but the fact that you would use ESG as a lens for making decisions to help you, we're not going to allow that. Now, again, there's a bunch of folks that are like, well, that's outrageous. You know, why shouldn't a money manager be able to use all tools at their you know, that are in front of them that they can use as they see fit? Well, these 17 states are kind of moving towards a, you know, no, we don't agree with this. We don't want it to happen. They're focusing, to your point, Alexis, a little bit more on the S and the G because they're opposed to that than on the E side. But they're also anti-E. You know, they tend to be supporters of oil and gas, and they tend to not want, you know, things to move so quickly. Even though the three of us would say that, you know, that ship has sailed, the genie's out of the bottle, you're not putting them back. And there's a variety of factors that are contributing to that, let alone the SEC's role in this, you know, climate, you know, disclosure. So,
okay. Well, I didn't want to over politicize the debate, but I thought it was worth mentioning because the SEC is a federal regulation. So whatever the states say, those climate disclosure standards will get passed. We'll see to which extent, but all of this won't matter, right? Once the SEC pulls the
yes
trigger.
And no. So it's interesting. Again, we could talk about this for a long time, but to keep it somewhat short, yes and no. So if when the SEC passes this, the SEC's rules will become effective nationally. But that will not stop the states from saying, hey, in our state, when we're investing our money, you're not allowed to do this. So we're talking about, you know, I'll give you kind of the states. It's Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Idaho, West Virginia, North Dakota, Wyoming, Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri. Okay, so those are the 17 states. So in those states, we've got a weird situation. You got a federal overlay of disclosure. You've got a state saying, we don't want you to use that for not necessarily SEC rules, but we don't want you to use ESG as a framework for investment. Well, okay, if you're a company and you're selling in the United States, forget whether you're a US company, what are you supposed to do? You know, we're selling goods. We are advertising that we are a ESG friendly company and we do, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, and these are our goals. You know, and we do this, this, and this, and we're all natural. Okay, well, in those states, what are you supposed to do? You know, how are you supposed to navigate those situations in, you know, Florida, Texas, Louisiana? It remains to be seen. You know, and so companies are treading a little bit lightly. To your point, this year I've seen a marked lessening of ESG flashing lights and people instead saying we are risk mitigating, we are focusing on resiliency, we are focusing on adaptation. Why? Because ESG has become a little bit charged politically, or a lot. And so why have that fight if you don't need to? Continue to do the same things that you're doing, call it something else and still achieve the objectives. You know, I get that. And that's not wrong. It's just companies looking to avoid a fight where it's unnecessary to have the fight, but still do, you know, good work.
Okay. Well, thanks for highlighting that. Sure. Maybe we hopefully we have 5 minutes extra for questions.
Yeah, we do. We definitely do. Thank you both so much. It was extremely educating, even for me. There's one question I want to address that came through that's around what key challenges businesses may face in implementing the new SEC regulations. And to keep it very practical, what are some strategies they can implement to overcome those challenges? And maybe we can just do 3 top ones, very practical, that we could advise them to implement.
Yeah, so
hire.
Go ahead, sorry.
Hire an excellent consultant. If you don't have internal talent to do this, which most don't, hire an excellent consultant. So be interviewing folks like you guys now. That would be my top thing. 2, make sure that those consultants understand the interplay. If you're selling abroad, what the difference is in the EU versus here. That's going to be important if you're selling overseas. If you're selling in the United States, it's still going to be relatively important, but you know, a little bit less so. So consultant, software, and then I would put 3rd, identify kind of your board and senior management, who the hell's got expertise. And if you don't have that, I'd be hunting right now to get that, because again, at some point that's going to find its way into your disclosure as to who the expert is. And if you don't have one, it's going to look a little odd, weird, awkward.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
Just to add some nuance to that, we've been working with a lot of small businesses for who hiring an extra person as a first step to doing this stuff is hard. So now, if you're under SEC, if the rule is applicable to you, I guess you have the budget, and that's fine. But let's look at it, let's look at the broad spectrum of companies. I think you can actually get started with just a project manager. We've seen a lot of our customers promote themselves on this topic, and it's actually a good career move. Sustainability is here to stay. And dependent on the size of the company, smaller, mid-sized businesses can actually, I would say, assign, people to this, because if you had this ruling 10 years ago, what you just said, Brad, was perfectly true. It's a big topic. It's going to take a ton of time. Let's have someone work on this full time. But now you've actually got softwares, and sorry for preaching from my own parish here, but which essentially minimize the time to get this stuff done. So everybody sees this as this massive workload that's gonna, suck someone. People are gonna spend their whole year on this, but the truth is, it's not what's happening in real life. So we see. I mean, again, it's dependent on the size and complexity of your business, right? And the bigger you are, the more prone you are to using a consultant. But we've seen a lot of listed companies, especially like in the tech sector, who basically are not particularly hiring for that. But they do get like the HR or the marketing or involved in this, and or finance, which essentially is connecting different softwares, getting it done. So yes, it's a bit of work, but I would like to stress the fact that yet finding a consultant seems like it's a long process. Finding a software in today's world, Googling it, finding the one that's right for your business, that has the right verticals, specialization, that has become super easy. Now, having said this, I do think that companies should commit for the long run. So actually having a dedicated resource in the long run is definitely a good idea. But to get started, it's not a prerequisite, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with that. We want to make it as easy as possible for everybody. So yeah, there are solutions out there. To reiterate a couple of key points that were mentioned during this session is just get prepared right now while you can. Don't wait until the SEC regulations are released. Internally, get your board members and C-suite exec on board, and we're happy to help with preparing any kind of decks to get this across the finish line. That's what we're here for. I wanted to say thank you to our speakers for participating today. It was very engaging and certainly educating even for myself. So thank you so much. And with that, we will finish our session. And if anybody has any questions afterwards, please reach out to us. We're here to connect further. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a super day.
Brad. Great talking to you today, and thanks for hosting us, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.
Total pleasure.
My pleasure.